Okay, so we can start. Good morning. Welcome, everyone. And I'd like to welcome in particular the speakers who came from different parts of the world to participate in this workshop on cartography and African languages. Here's the program. So the basic topic that we'd like to discuss with this highly qualified audience is the mutual contributions that can be given by cartography to the study of African languages and vice versa, right? So cartographic research, as you know, has triggered a lot of theory-guided descriptive work about different languages of the world and about African languages in particular from a particular perspective, the perspective and the angle of structural configurations. And of course, this hopefully will lead to extend the analysis of understudied languages, which will then become less understudied, and contribute to the documentation of endangered languages as well, the small but not insignificant contribution that linguists can give to the preservation of biodiversity. And then on the other side, as you know, certain morphological characteristics of African languages offer important variations on the theme of syntactic structures, and these properties can clearly illustrate certain characteristics of structural configurations which maybe are less visible in other languages. It will be the case, for instance, for the overt marking of properties like topicalité and focus that will be discussed by several contributions today. Okay, so as in the best tradition of comparative generative grammar, and in general, in the best tradition of linguistic studies, theory and description should really go hand in hand with enriched and enhanced descriptions made possible by theoretical guidelines, which will in turn stimulate theoretical innovation. And the African languages and African linguistics has an important role to play in this kind of interaction. So now, going back to the beginning of cartographic studies, around the mid-80s, you typically see structural representations like these, and you still see such representations, of course. If you open a minimalist paper, you'll see essentially, by and large, this kind of representation. And that's perfectly legitimate, right? If you are not focusing on the details of structure, it's perfectly legitimate and coherent to use simplified representations. But then if you're interested in structural details, it's clear that such representations do not have enough space, so that you need richer representations. That was the idea that Jean-Yves Colloque developed many years ago. He observed that if you want to capture the distribution of the verb in a language like French with respect to different types of adverbials, you must postulate different positions, and in these representations, simply there is not enough room. So Pollock's idea was to split inflection into finer components such as agreement and tense. So Jean-Yves Colloque came up with the first little tree, this one here, with tense higher than agreement, and this would give more structure. And then shortly afterwards, Adriana Belletti, working on the structure of Italian, basically adopted Pollock's structure, but observed that the order should be the other way around. So this is a typical cartographic question. Given these components, what is their respective order? And then what Belletti showed was that if you want to account for the order of affixes in the Romance languages, like partiront in French, under Baker's mirror principle, you'd need that order rather than the other one. And then shortly later, 1 year later, Chomsky, in the first economy paper, said that maybe both Pollock and Belletti were right, and that there was more than one agreement position, and a higher agreement position and a lower agreement position surrounding the tense expression. Now, here, as elsewhere, it became good cartographic practice to look around the languages of the world to see if there is some language that maybe shows in a very transparent manner what is abstractly assumed for certain languages. And then this was not exactly what happened at the time, but one could have looked at certain Bantu languages like Swahili, which clearly, very overtly show in the morphology the kind of arrangement that Chomsky assumed, with a higher agreement, agreement S, a lower agreement, agreeing with the object, and in the middle, the tense specification. Okay. Now, then going back to the history of cartography, clearly the splitting procedure could not stop at this point, because if you add more adverbs, it's clear that you need more positions. So if you add a third adverb in addition to pas and complètement, let's say something like toujours, always, then there is another possible position that the verb can take. And then, of course, the strategy was to further refine the splitting. But this also raised the question, will we ever get to a bedrock, right? Will we ever get to the atoms of syntax? Is there a point at which splitting is not possible because we have reached the ultimate constituents of syntax? So at that point, we are in the first part of the 90s, in discussions with Guglielmo Cinque, the idea was introduced that perhaps we could turn the problem upside down and ask the question of the maximal expansion of zones, right? So questions like, what is the maximal set of properties that a certain zone of the syntactic tree can or must express, and what is the maximal expansion of each individual zone? And then, are these properties always expressed by syntactic features which define heads, or there is some other way of expressing properties? So we phrased the problem in this way, and this was the official beginning of cartographic studies. The hope here was that this strategy could do justice to the complexity of syntactic configurations by identifying reasonable upper limits. So that's the maximal complexity that we can expect. And perhaps the hope was that this would bring us closer to identifying the ultimate ingredients, so the atoms of syntax. Now, and then a principle played an important role here. This principle was around as a kind of methodological guideline already in the early 90s and mid-90s. Then it received a name by Richard Kane as principle of decompositionality. And the idea is this, that one interpretable syntactic feature, so one feature relevant for syntax and which is visible at the interfaces, which is visible for interpretation, corresponds to one lexical item, one item of the functional lexicon, and this corresponds to one head. So when the system enters syntax, it constitutes an individual head. So as I said, there were different versions of this idea that circulated. An important antecedent of these ideas was the idea of lexical decomposition in generative semantics, which, of course, pursued it in a completely different perspective, but the idea was very similar. So this simple straightforward methodological principle determines lexical and syntactic representations that are locally very simple. So if you take a magnifying lens and you look at individual components, you see very simple structures. Heads defined by a single property with immediate dependence, and that's it, essentially. Conglomerates like verbs inflected for agreement, mood, tense, aspect, voice, and so on, of course, can exist in natural languages, but are only created by syntax through movement. So merge is at the basis of everything. External merge for initial configurations, and then movement for creating conglomerates. So there is an idea of local simplicity, which, I mean, the price to pay to really push that is a lot of complexity at the global level, right? So as there are many properties to express, if each individual component is very simple, you will need many components fundamentally. And so you'll need representations in which properties are distributed over large areas of the syntactic tree. That's the idea. And this led, as you know, to Cinque's famous splitting of the inflectional system in his book Adverbs and Functional Heads as a very rich map of this kind, with heads of tense, aspect, voice, mood, and so on and so forth. And this also led to my proposals and other people's proposals on the splitting of the complementizer system as involving an area that is delimited by certain heads, like force and finiteness, and in the space that is thus created, there are lots of other heads that typically express scope discourse properties like topicality, focus, etc., and other properties. So the empirical coverage quickly grew, starting from Romance and Germanic. This is particularly true for the splitting of the complementizer system. Cinque's analysis of the IP system was immediately expressed with a large cross-linguistic basis. But the study of the complementizer system really started with Romance and Germanic, and then very quickly extended to other language families within Indo-European, outside Indo-European, so Basque, Finno-Ugric, Turkic languages, Semitic languages, and so on. And of course, a very important role was played in this phase by African languages, starting with Enoch Abo's seminal work on Be languages and Gungbe in particular. Of course, Enoch was invited to this conference but could not participate unfortunately, for compelling family reasons. But his work will be very present, I think, in today's discussion. And also work on Bantu languages. I'll mention a few cases. I already mentioned something. Then there's a lot of interest started for cartographic studies in the Far East, with a lot of work on Chinese, the very active Beijing group, and also on Japanese and other languages, native languages of the Americas, native languages of Australia, Austronesian languages, Creole languages, particularly with Drulemann's work on Jamaican Creole. Some sign languages were also studied in this perspective, and then a lot of input was offered by cartographic work to Romance and Germanic dialectology, and also to the study of historical linguistics. So in the course of about 2 decades, this line of research got very well established. Okay, now as I'll be talking about the left periphery, and some other talks will talk about that, let me quickly mention the criterial approach to scope discourse properties, approach according to which there's the left periphery is populated by a series of heads that transparently express scope discourse properties like topicality, focus, and so on. And these heads, in this very structural view, do 2 things. In syntax, they attract movement. And at the interfaces, they guide the interpretation, both at the semantic interface and at the phonological interfaces, with the assignment of proper intonational contours. Okay, so this amounts to saying that if you take classical A-bar constructions like WH movement, like topic comment, like focus presupposition, the criterial view postulates the presence of an abstract head that does these two things, attracts the element, say WH movement, or attracts the topic or the focus, and then at the interfaces determines how the structure is interpreted. And of course, these configurations are called criterial by stressing the similarity and also the complementarities of A criteria, like the theta criterion fundamentally, assignment of thematic roles, and A-bar criteria, like the topic criterion, the focus criterion, and so on and so forth. In both cases, it's a head that determines the way in which meaning is extracted from structure. Okay, so that's why this terminology of criteria was used. Then here comes the role of Enoch's work and his analysis of Gungbe. The observation was that in this language, as in fact in many other languages, African and not, there are these overt markers that overtly indicate if some kind of phrase is to be interpreted as a topic, as a focus, and so on and so forth. So ya is a topic marker and determines the interpretation of an element as the topic of the embedded clause in this case. We is a focus marker and determines the focal interpretation. And then, as Enoch showed, the two types of elements can co-occur in the same structure. You can have a topic and a focus, and if they co-occur in a particular order, and I will come back to this property. Okay, there are other explicit criterial markers, like Q markers, for instance, even something like esque in French can be considered as a Q marker for WH questions, but I will not spend time on this. Now, the analysis was conducted by adopting this very important principle that was expressed by Chomsky in the years 2000, but in fact, this has been the guiding principle of comparative generative grammar since the early 70s, right? So the idea that you should start from uniformity assumptions, from the idea that languages are uniform. Of course, that's not true, so you have to weaken their assumption, but you have to start from the uniformity assumption. Because if you do it the other way around and assume that each language goes its own way, you just don't go anywhere. You don't get anywhere, unfortunately. Okay, so by using uniformity guidelines, we could make the hypothesis, and we did make the hypothesis, that every language works in the way that is abstractly represented by these African languages, with structural configurations of heads, specifiers, and complements, and which specifiers and complements that received certain interpretations on the basis of the properties of the heads. So that was the guiding intuition that we had here. Now, of course, if you have an overt marker, it's much easier to analyze it than if we have an abstractly postulated marker, right? So we can immediately ask all sorts of analytical questions, like the one that we have here. Take the markers of Gungbe as Enoch analyzed them, then we can ask the question, is the right configuration this one, with the marker that is part of the clausal spine and with the XP that is attracted as its specifier, or could the marker be a case-like element, a postposition-like element directly attached to the phrase to be interpreted as topic, focus, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for instance, there were discussions with Klaus Abels about the distinction between these two representations. And then it's possible to argue very directly for one or the other representations on the basis of empirical evidence if we have an overt marker, right? So, for instance, one can observe that in languages in which we have WH movement and some in C2 constructions, in the movement case, we have the overt marker expressed, as in Gungbe, for instance. So we say things like, where focus marker he went. But if the WH element is in C2, for instance, in echo questions in this language, he went where, the marker cannot appear. And of course, this distribution is immediately expected if the marker is part of the causal spine, because it's only when the left periphery is involved that the marker can appear. Okay, so for this particular case, it was clear that the causal spine hypothesis was the correct one. This is another case in a language, Ga, that was analyzed by Sheila Torto in her thesis in the MA program in Siena, where you have both WH movement in this language, this Kwa language spoken in Ghana, both WH movement and WH in Situ, like French, and again, the marker only appears when movement takes place. Okay, now then there are other types, very simple types of evidence. For instance, consider the distribution of the marker when you have a conjunction of noun phrases and the conjunction functions as a topic. So suppose John and Bill, marker, let's say topic marker or focus marker. Now the analysis according to which the marker is part of the causal spine predicts that we will have only this representation because there will be one occurrence of the marker and then there could be a coordination of elements at the level of the XP. Whereas the idea that the marker could be a kind of case or postposition would also be consistent with the distribution of the marker over the conjunction. Now, what happens in languages like Gungbe is that, in fact, you cannot distribute the marker over the conjunction. So if you want to say something like a house and a car, focus, suru, boat, you must have a single marker attached to the whole coordinate structure, and you cannot distribute the marker. Similarly, you cannot distribute the topic marker, and again, this goes with the assumption that the correct analysis is the one given in A. Now, okay, there are other types of evidence that are not of immediate relevance for the study of African languages. Now, on the other hand, in other languages, there is evidence that seems to go in the other direction. There are some languages in which, in fact, things like topic markers or focus markers are definitely part of the XP and not part of the causal spine. For instance, Durleman observed that in Jamaican Creole, de, that he analyzes as a topic marker, can distribute over conjunction. So you can say things like, as for the child, that book, those people, I don't want to have to deal with them anymore. And then each one of the conjoined DPs can have what she analyzes as a topic marker. Okay, so this suggests that in this case, the marking is done phrase internally, which suggests that we have, I mean, the language faculty must allow for both options, essentially. And there are also languages in which it's reasonable to argue that both the phrases are marked as belonging to a certain kind of construction, and the corresponding head is marked. Like in exclamative sentences in Italian, che macchine, che moto, che hai comprato, what a car and what a motorcycle, that this is the head marker of the construction. We have both the phrases and the head in the causal spine that are marked, so the representation would be something like this. So this amounts to saying that in as far as the issue of overt morphological marking is concerned, we have a principle and a parameter. The principle that we can assume is that we systematically have in this configuration a spec head configuration with spec and head having a certain featural characterization. And as for the morphological manifestation of the feature, we have all the possibilities, essentially. Either the construction, for instance, exclamatives in Italian, is marked both on the specifier and on the head, or just on the specifier, like topics in Jamaican, as we saw, or just on the head, as topic and focus in Gungbe, or neither on the specifier nor on the head, like in topic and focus in English and Romance languages, in which nothing is morphologically marked, and the structure is just expressed by ordering properties, essentially. Okay, so let me very briefly comment on two generalizations, mention one problem, and then I will stop for this introductory part. One generalization concerning topics and foci is that topics may be multiple. So some languages, like the Romance languages, can have 2, 3, 4, 5 topics with clitic dislocation in Romance. For instance, we clearly can multiply them. But left peripheral focus is typically unique, right? So you cannot, for instance, have corrective focus in Italian by correcting two things. You've got to correct one thing at a time per structure, essentially. And this is observed also in languages with overt markers, like ABG, like in Hager and Bua's dissertation, another Kwa language spoken in Ivory Coast, has a topic marker, has a focus marker, whereas topic markers can be multiple, as in this kind of example. The focus marker is always unique. And so this difference is very easy to determine in languages with overt markers, because you just count the markers, essentially. And you see that focus markers are typically unique. So here is a bunch of languages showing the uniqueness of left peripheral focus, and particularly languages with overt markers, like these languages, for instance, in Baza, that Paul Basson has studied. The marker is a little bit more complex because we have both a class marker agreeing with the nominal expression and then a piece of morphology expressing if this is a topic or this is a focus, and so on and so forth. And again, we can have just one focus marker in these cases. Many years ago, I proposed an interface analysis, and I still stick to it, according to which the reason why we cannot have multiple left peripheral foci has to do with the interpretation of the structure. So the focal head determines interpretation of the specifier as focus of the appropriate kind, and of the complement as presupposition, something that I agree on with my interlocutor. So that if we had a recursion of foci, we would have one position, the specifier of the lower focus, which should be focal as specifier of focus, but that should be part of the presupposition, because it's part of the presupposition of the first focus, and this creates a conflict that determines the fact that we cannot have multiplicity of foci, okay? So this was the idea. There are many issues that arise, which I will not go into, and the difference with topics is that the notion of comment is so weak that nothing prevents a comment to have the topic-comment structure, so that a recursion of topics is not precluded by considerations about the interpretation. Okay, let me mention a second generalization, and then I'll stop. When topic and focus can co-occur, in the core case, topic is higher than focus. So we find the order topic higher, preceding, and commanding focus. Okay? This is shown by many languages with overt markers. For instance, in Gungbe, if you try, when topic and focus co-occur, I think that this book, topic Suru focus, will read. If you try to invert them, you get an ungrammatical sentence. Same story in Baza, a Bantu language spoken in Cameroon. Same story in a completely different kind of language that uses overt topic and focus markers, Maori, an Austronesian language, and similarly for languages that do not have overt marking. Typically, say in Hungarian, for instance, topic is typically higher than focus, and similarly in other languages. Why is it so? Well, the idea that I proposed in recent work is that, again, this has to do with interface properties. Suppose that in the topic configuration, we have a topic head that takes a specifier to be interpreted as topic and a complement to be interpreted as the comment, right? And then there are certain interpretive properties that must be associated with topic and comment. With topic, the property associated is that it must be salient in discourse somehow, and we can make that precise. It's not completely straightforward, but something along these lines must be right. Whereas, as far as the comment is concerned, I think a reasonable condition is that the comment must contain a focus, right? Because otherwise the comment would be vacuous. We want the comment to somehow say something that whose knowledge is not attributed to my interlocutor. Now, if we make that assumption, we immediately capture the order of the core order of topic and focus, because if the order is topic higher than focus, of course the comment of the higher topic will contain a focus by definition. Whereas if we have the opposite ordering, the comment indicated in green in this structure will not contain the focus, which is up here, right outside, and given the uniqueness of focus, it will not be possible to have another focus inside. So in this way, through a very simple interface consideration, we capture the order topic focus. Now, let me mention a problem, and then I will finish. In work that is now ongoing with Paul Bassong and Adriana Belletti, we looked at cases in Basa, and we observed that the language corresponds to the generalization number 2. So typically, a topic must be higher than a focus, and this is true for different kinds of topics, like what Paul calls additive topics, and for contrastive topics, for other types of topics which have slightly different markers. That's the only possible order. If we change the order and we have the focus higher than the topic, the structure is ungrammatical. Okay? But there is one systematic exception. That is to say, a topic-like subject with the marker for additivity and for the marker with the marker of contrastiveness can also be found in a postfocal position. So we can have, like here, it is the book focus that the teacher with the additivity in interpretation or the contrast interpretation in subject position, and that is possible. So 2 questions. Why do we have this exception to a topic-focused generalization, and why is it restricted to subjects? The analysis that we are developing, again, I repeat, this is ongoing work, is to try to capitalize on the well-known similarity between topics and subjects, a familiar topic ever since at least Lee and Thompson's seminal work. So topicality and subject have something in common. For instance, the aboutness relation, right? The comment is about the topic, much as the predicate is about the subject. And then there are various differences, of course, but clearly there is an element of similarity. So the idea is that due to this similarity, certain auxiliary features like plus additive and plus contrastive can attach both to topics and subjects. As they can attach to subjects, it will be possible to keep the subject in subject position with the relevant additive or contrastive interpretation preceded by the left peripheral focus, so that we end up with a little map of the structure of this kind, with a left periphery involving a topic higher and a focus lower. So if a non-subject is involved, the order will necessarily be topic focus, but then with the possibility of adding these special features to the subject position, which can determine the order focus followed by a subject with the additive or the contrastive interpretation. Okay, so that's the idea that is only worked out in part, and that we will certainly develop in the weeks and months to come. Okay, so let me conclude. Mutual contributions of cartography and study of African languages. We have seen several cases. The overt scope markers, the scope discourse markers, permit detailed analysis of their morphosyntactic status that are not obviously available for the postulation of phonetically non-realized markers. Then we have seen two generalizations involving topic and focus and the role of interfaces in explanation. And then there are exceptions. I've just mentioned one. There are other exceptions and possible ways to go to explain the exceptions away. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.